There are a lot of ways to gauge equality. We can look at the ability of the community to hang out in their own spaces, we can look at anti-discrimination laws and legal equality. Access to government services like healthcare and pensions have also been central to advocacy. The election of queer politicians are some of many milestones that we've celebrated over the years. Thanks to protests, lawsuits, and a whole lot of work, Canada is one of the top places to live if you're queer. Hi, I'm Rowan, and today we're going to be looking at a timeline of queer discrimination and rights in Canada. This can't just be a list of dates and names though, this isn't high school history. We have to ask why things changed, so let's look at where we started and how we got to today. Pre-Canada, there were queer Indigenous people, and they're still here. There was a wide range of identities across different cultures, but a lot about those identities were erased thanks to residential schools and queerphobic religious pressure. Sadly, a lot of those identities and histories weren't well documented, so the focus of this video will be on after Canada was founded. European culture has a long history of homophobia. This was codified in Canada with a variety of laws, including buggery, which got reclassified in 1892 as offences against morality to target all male gay activity. There weren't laws specifically targeting lesbians, but queer women were often institutionalized or forced to marry men due to the lack of economic opportunity. After the Second World War, more young people were living away from their parents, allowing them to experiment. As more and more people started to become aware of queer identities, there started to be institutional pushback. In 1953, the Immigration Act was amended to ban gays and lesbians from immigrating. In the 1960s, the RCMP also targeted gay and lesbian federal employees. This was the height of the Cold War, and the excuse was either that they were likely to be communists or were vulnerable to being blackmailed and outed by foreign agents. This quickly expanded until the RCMP were surveilling 9,000 people in Ottawa alone. The moral panics of the early 60s culminated in homosexuals being labeled dangerous sexual offenders by the courts. This could mean prison for life for men who were arrested multiple times. This is what happened to Everett Clippert. Clippert was a gay man from Calgary who was sent to prison repeatedly. After his second conviction, he was deemed unreformable and sentenced to life without parole. His appeal to the Supreme Court was dismissed, and Tommy Douglas called on then Justice Minister Pierre Trudeau to decriminalize homosexuality. Trudeau agreed, announcing famously that the government had no place in the bedrooms of the nation. When the bill was introduced in April 1969, the new Justice Minister John Turner announced that he did not want to encourage homosexuality, merely to remove the stigma of the law. So not exactly enthusiastic allies there. Homosexuality was officially decriminalized in August 1969. I'm putting a link to a documentary about Everett Clippert below. It's worth your time. With decriminalization done, public demonstrations were now much more possible. In 1971, the We Demand March on Parliament saw 200 people march in the rain to make 10 demands. They asked for the repeal of sexual morality laws, immigration restrictions, and different age of consent laws. They also asked for anti-discrimination protections and legal equality. It took 48 years for all these demands to be met. Organizing got more bold, but it was able to get more specific. In 1973, Toronto became the first city in Canada to enact anti-discrimination legislation. This was less useful than hoped for, as you'll see in a moment though. In the same year, the Lesbian Mothers Defense Fund was founded to help fight custody battles against homophobic ex-husbands and judges. 1977 saw the first cross-Canada protest as queers across the country boycotted CBC after the news affiliate refused to air a PSA for a gay hotline. It was unsuccessful in getting the PSA published, but it was a big step in the community's awareness of themselves. The arrest and abuse of patrons of the Trucks and Les Mystiques bars in Montreal in 1977 sparked a huge outcry. 2,000 people showed up to protest. Cops ran their motorcycles into the crowd to try and disperse them. This violence made even more people mad at the police. In response, the Quebec government became the first provincial government in Canada to adopt anti-discrimination legislation. It protected housing, public accommodations, and employment. But like Toronto, this was only so effective. In 1981, there was another police raid called Operation Soap. Police raided 4 bathhouses and arrested 300 men, subjecting them to rectal searches and verbal abuse. The next day, 3,000 people marched down Yonge Street and almost stormed the provincial legislature before the police beat them back. Many people cite this protest as the point where a lot of queers realized that decriminalization wasn't enough. Many people had been okay with being half out. Some people in their lives would know they could go to private gay spaces and live quietly with their partners. Queer people realized that they couldn't quietly live out their lives if the police were going to constantly barge into these private spaces. In the pre-internet era, the queer community couldn't move anywhere else. They needed in-person spaces like bars, bathhouses, and stores to meet and socialize. But these businesses and their patrons were all being harassed by police. This motivation was timely, as 1982 was a busy year for the queer community. A new constitution was created, which included the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which we still use today. Sexual orientation and gender identity weren't listed as protected groups, but it did launch a new wave of human rights challenges that actually started to win. Previously, challenges to the Constitution had mostly been used to raise awareness and campaign for new laws, not to get rights through the courts. Actually getting rights read into the Charter created a huge shift in advocacy. 1982 also saw the beginning of the HIV/AIDS pandemic in Canada. The virus had been in the US for at least a year, but finally hit Canada full force, and several service groups were organized to help victims. This was done without government support. The Saskatchewan health minister apparently wrote "go to hell" on a funding application. Without a proper HIV blood test, gay and bisexual men, as well as many trans women, were banned from donating blood, and a partial ban is still in place today, despite all blood now being tested regardless of risk. With the virus ravaging the community, queer activism migrated to health, and in 1987, people successfully lobbied the Mulroney government to allow a medication that had been approved in the US to skip medical trials and be used to treat AIDS patients in Canada immediately. The queer community also got its first member of parliament when NDP MP Sven Robinson came out as gay in 1988. Bars weren't the only queer businesses getting targeted. In the 1990s, the Mulroney government cracked down on obscene materials crossing the border. Little Sisters bookstore in Vancouver had 75% of their materials seized by customs, often preemptively. The bookstore had to prove to customs after the fact that their books were legal. They spent 10 years in court before the Supreme Court ruled that Canadian Border Services had been homophobic and couldn't just grab items without proof. Now that the queer community was really growing, there was starting to be room for even smaller sub-communities to find each other and create identities. In 1990, the word Two-Spirit was coined at a Native American First Nations gay and lesbian conference in Winnipeg. Two-Spirit allows people to explore their gender and sexual identity, as well as Indigenous faith traditions outside of Western norms and contexts, and reclaims some of what it was lost to colonialism. 1992 saw a big win for gay and lesbian civil servants as the ban on gays in the military and RCMP were lifted. Michelle Douglas was dismissed from the Canadian Armed Forces and sued under the Charter. The government settled and changed the rules the day the court proceedings were due to start. A similar case from Captain Joshua Birch had the courts read sexual orientation into the Human Rights Act. Not quite the Charter, but that happened in 1995. A gay couple, Jimmy Gann and Jack Nesbitt, sued for spousal pension and old age security benefits. They lost the case, but the court ruled that their charter rights were violated. No one really knew what to do with the split decision, but they sure kept filing court cases. In the same year, an Ontario court legalized adoption for gay couples. In 1998, the Vren decision said that provincial governments couldn't discriminate against gay people. And in 1999, a lesbian successfully sued to get support payments from her ex-partner, forcing Ontario to update their marriage legislation. Winnipeg also made waves in 1998 by electing not just the first gay mayor in Canada, but all of North America, Glenn Murray. Things were really looking up as we entered the 21st century, but 2000 did include the last big raid on a queer establishment, the Pussy Palace, and included 350 women, many of them fully or partially nude, searched and harassed by male officers. This led to huge demonstrations and outrage. Canada was mostly moving beyond the harassment of queer businesses and censorship by the early 2000s, though, and the last raids were in 2004 in Calgary and Hamilton. Instead, Canada turned to focusing on legislative equality, especially marriage. One of the more famous moments in Canadian queer history was a 2001 double wedding with a gay and a lesbian couple, officiated by Reverend Brent Hawks of the Metropolitan Community Church. Because their application for a marriage license would surely be denied, the Reverend instead read banns in the church that the couples attended. The wedding wasn't recognized at the time, but raised the profile of the gay marriage debate. What's fascinating about gay marriage in Canada, looking back, is how it teetered on the edge for so long. Common law marriages were recognized in 2000, there were court cases going back and forth, politicians taking stands, and then it all happened. In 2003, the Ontario court ruled that the province had to recognize same-sex marriages, and Michael Leshner and Michael Stark had the first legally recognized wedding in the country. Within 2 years, 8 provinces had started to perform same-sex marriages. In 2005, the Paul Martin government passed the Civil Marriage Act, and Canada became the 4th country in the world to recognize same-sex marriage. Things were pretty quiet for the next decade, though there were a few election firsts. Kathleen Wynne was elected as the first queer premier in Ontario in 2013. Trans people also had a major milestone, when Alberta MLA Esteban Cortez Vargas came out as non-binary in the middle of a legislative debate, which is an excellent way to make sure things are official, because that is going to be on the official record forever. Things have moved really fast in the last few years, at least for government speed. Trans people got protection in 2017, as the Canada Human Rights Act was extended to include gender identity and expression, extended hate speech laws, and made targeting of trans people a hate crime. The same year, the Ontario government became the first province to allow non-binary gender markers on ID. Many other governments soon followed, which is why my driver's license now has a nice X on it. In 2018, it was announced that the many people like Clippert who had been convicted under homophobic laws could have their records expunged. And in 2019, consent laws were changed, so the age of consent is now the same across the board. The last request of the 1971 We Demand March to be enacted. In 2020, APV Canada endorsed mixed orientation relationships as a legitimate family, in this case between a gay man and a straight woman. This broadens the idea of marriage from just about romantic and sexual attraction to commitment, something asexual and aromantic advocates especially have been excited about. The Two-Spirit community had a big win in the 2021 federal election when Blake Desjardins, a Two-Spirit man, was elected as an NDP MP from Alberta. In 2021, Parliament also unanimously passed a ban on conversion therapy, an extremely harmful practice. It's 2024 now, and we are currently experiencing serious backlash to a lot of these changes. Transphobic beliefs have filtered from authoritarian movements in Europe and the US, as well as homegrown Canadian movements. This has resulted in restrictions around sexual education, outing trans students to their parents, and withholding necessary medical care to trans youth. This video is about political equality, and the queer community has legal equality on the books in many cases, but that doesn't always apply to people's actions. Queer people also need to feel safe in their families, neighborhoods, and religious communities, which the law can't do much about. For politics, the focus is now on expanding equality to the trans community, who have long been neglected in the fight for rights, especially medical discrimination. A lot of focus is also on schools and the queer kids who can't advocate for themselves. Queer youth still face incredibly high rates of homelessness and abuse. Gay street alliances need to be guaranteed the right to meet safely, and sex education needs to include queer people and relationships. Queer Canadians have worked really hard to make this country what it is today, and while it's easy to point to a few milestones like decriminalization or gay marriage, it's important to remember that there have been so many protests, so many laws and policies changed, and so many little changes that could fill books and won't get mentioned in a short little video like this one, which is why I'm posting some resources below in our source list. I know we often gauge how queer-friendly a place is by when it legalized gay marriage, and it's not the worst metric, but that happened when I was a kid. I'm so sorry if that makes you feel old. In researching this video, there are like 4 things listed here that I actively worked on. I've harassed politicians, I've sat through council meetings, I've gone to protests. This is still happening. This isn't just history, it's happening today. We talk about a lot of legal changes in this video. We talk about the Civil Marriage Act and the Canadian Human Rights Act, but how does a law get made? How does it get through Parliament? Well, we're talking about that next month, so be sure to subscribe to see that video. European culture has a long history of homophobia. This was codified in Canada with a variety of laws, including, for